Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf. I'm joined today by Robert Mary, who is a former Washington journalist and publishing executive, and author of 5 books on American history and foreign policy, including most recently, President McKinley, Architect of the American Century. We talk about the life and presidency of William McKinley and make some comparisons to our current political moment today with the second Trump administration. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Robert, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Tom, it's my pleasure to be with you.
And among other things, you're a resident expert in the presidency of William McKinley. Why is he a forgotten president? Is he a forgotten president? I get the sense that he is, but maybe you would quibble with that. But if he is a forgotten president relative to others, why do you think that is? And then why did you decide to pick him up as someone that was compelling to you?
Well, I would say, Tom, that he's not only forgotten, but he's underrated. So I'm forgotten in the sense that we don't really know about him very much, the American people. He doesn't loom large in our history. So that's the forgotten aspect. I tried to do something about that with my biography of William McKinley, President McKinley it was entitled. The subtitle was rather brazenly called Architect of the American Century, because I think he is a very consequential president. So not only forgotten, but also sort of not appreciated to the extent that perhaps he deserved to be. There are a lot of reasons for that. I think that a lot of it has to do with Teddy Roosevelt, of all things. Teddy Roosevelt succeeded William McKinley when William McKinley was killed by an assassin in Buffalo in 1901. And Roosevelt was not a man to share the credit with anybody for anything. And he pretty much didn't follow McKinley, kind of trashed him a little bit after he took over. Basically said, I'm going to conduct myself as if I was the man elected and not McKinley. And the TR biographers, very hagiographic, sort of fell in love with TR. So the concept of TR is that he actually ushered America into the 20th century. I think that's not quite right. I think that McKinley had a lot to do with ushering America into the 20th century, as I'm sure we'll talk about. So I guess that's why I think that he's been somewhat forgotten. I think the other thing has to do with the fact that there was a period during the end of the 18th century in which there weren't any really big presidencies from Lincoln to TR, people think. And so it's easy to sort of lump McKinley in with the people that preceded him, Benjamin Harrison, and others, Grover Cleveland, Chet Arthur, who didn't really leave much of a mark. So McKinley gets lumped in with those guys, and I think erroneously.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Well, that makes sense. And yeah, I mean, just kind of reading some of your writing on McKinley, I do get a sense that he's more consequential. There's a lot more happening than perhaps we care to remember. But before we really get into the presidency, I mean, what came before with McKinley? Like, where is he from? What was his upbringing? What was his education, his family life, things of that sort, his sort of core biography?
He grew up in Ohio in a family of strong Republicans, strong anti-slavery sentiment among his mother and father. His father ran a foundry, and they had a pretty solid but not spectacular middle-class life. They also ran a country store in addition to the foundry. At age 18, the Civil War breaks out, and he takes his time to determine whether he wants to enlist in the Army. I don't mean a lot of time, but he and his cousin basically said, we need to check this thing out. So they traveled to where the recruitment station was and asked a lot of questions and finally decided that they needed to get into that war. The cousin was excused because of some medical problems. But McKinley had a very, very successful wartime experience. He was drummed in as a private. He left the military as a brevet major. And most of those promotions, and they were substantial, were a result of McKinley having some pretty heroic actions. One in particular, at the Battle of Antietam, he was a quartermaster, which meant that he was responsible for provisioning the troops. And he was assigned to a particular unit. And they found themselves pinned down in the middle of the Battle of Antietam, which, as you know, is the bloodiest battle, single-day battle in the history of America. And these people were pinned down and had not had any breakfast, and now it's like into the afternoon, and they're in deep, deep trouble. So he provisions a wagon and gets a volunteer to help him, and he goes through the forest where the battle is, on the edges of the battle, and then makes a run for it to try to get to these troops. He succeeds, but they shoot off the back of the wagon, and he made it. And one of the officers said, "God bless the lad." So he was a man of some substance and mark, and left an impression on his superior officers, and got promoted. And then after that, he decided he wanted to be a lawyer. So he gets a law degree through some courses at a university in Pennsylvania, as well as in those days you did a lot of sort of apprentice type work with other lawyers. And he did that, became a lawyer, moved to Canton, Ohio, married the belle of Canton, who ended up with a lot of medical problems, and he was very devoted to her and needed to be because of her situation, and emerged as a civic leader in Canton and soon became a member of Congress.
What was the move from sort of even locally in Canton from private life as a lawyer? Because it makes sense to me, like if you're going to run for public office, having a law background and then also being a veteran to serve nobly, like those are two things that mark you as, out as a leader in your society. Those, or at least those are things that I think I would maybe look at, if nothing else, but those are pretty decent qualifications for public life. But what was the move for him from, private life as a lawyer to into politics?
Well, there's nothing better than the strong military experience for political credentials, and he, of course, had that. But he also, his commanding officer, I'm drawing a blank now, the president from Ohio, he had a mentor who was his commanding officer during his time in the military. And this officer became president in 1876, at the same time that McKinley became a member of the House. So when he was in Washington, he was invited to the White House a great deal of the time, and emerged with a certain amount of prominence in Washington, as well as in Ohio. What we see in McKinley, now that we're talking about him as a politician, and I'll just talk about one trait in particular. He was not a man of bombast. He didn't have a lot of what we would call today charisma. He was a solid, stolid guy who was friendly faced and not harsh in any way. One historian of the period said he's probably the nicest man who ever became president. And yet he seemed to always get his way. And he managed to deal with people who thought they were manipulating him when in fact he was manipulating them into thinking that they came up with the ideas that he wanted them to come up with. And so he had a way of what I call stealthy leadership. And it was very effective that way. In terms of his constituents, they all liked him. He was a very pleasant, measured fellow, laughed easily, not particularly witty, and not a visionary. The great visionaries of that period were Teddy Roosevelt and Captain Mahan of the Navy, who wrote about the importance of sea power, and Henry Cabot Lodge. And they had this vision of American greatness and America being the most powerful nation on the earth. McKinley didn't harbor those kinds of ideas. He was a manager, and he was very, very adept at understanding the implications of events as they unfolded around him and figuring out how to exploit them to his own ends. But he wasn't a tub thumper or a particularly outspoken man in the civic sense.
That's very interesting. We will we'll have to return to that, I think, later when we talk a little bit about maybe the romanticization of McKinley in the Trump era. But I talked with Troy Senik about his biography on Grover Cleveland, or we did this on the podcast, so I guess I wasn't the interviewer. And Troy made the point that the sort of cri de coeur for Cleveland was anti-corruption and trying to root out corruption at all levels of government, no matter where he was. That was one of his sort of hallmarks of his public life. What was that for McKinley? What was the animating spirit or sort of core issue or cause that McKinley was devoted to? Did he have one?
Yeah, I would say that McKinley was not a crusader when it came to corruption, but he was very strong in terms of his convictions and his principles. And a great example, if I can sort of take just a couple minutes here, was when
Sure.
he sent his great assistant to New York to talk to the bosses of the Republican Party in New York and Pennsylvania and Maine and New England. And these were people who really controlled the Republican conventions, the nominating conventions. He wanted to know whether they would support McKinley. So the guy goes to New York and other points east and talks to the bosses and comes back. This will be Mark Hanna. And he comes back and he tells McKinley, says, well, Governor, it's all over but the shouting. These guys will support you totally, but there's some conditions. What are the conditions? Asked McKinley. This was after a nice dinner in Cleveland at Mark Hanna's home on Lake Erie. And in the library of Hanna, and they're all smoking cigars and talking about the future. And Hanna says, well, they want the Treasury Secretaryship. They want all the patronage from New York and Pennsylvania and New England. And he ticked off a few other things. And McKinley rose from the chair, puffed on the cigar a bit, paced a little bit, turned around to Mark Hanna and said, Mark, if that's the price, it's too high a price. It's not worth anything to me and not anything to the American people, so I'm out of it. Hold on there, Governor, says, by this time, McKinley was governor of Ohio. Hold on there, Governor. This is how you could get it immediately, but you can still beat these guys. So the bosses coalesced with a mission of destroying McKinley's career and his presidential aspirations. But he beat them. And as typical of McKinley, he was a maneuverer, and he maneuvered so stealthily and so cleverly that people didn't always recognize how effective he was. Oh, and then you asked about what would be his trademark. We'll probably talk about this later, I'm sure, in addition to now, but he carved out for himself very, very early in his congressional career. He was 14 years in the House of Representatives, including chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over tariffs, of course. And he carved out for himself to be the chief expert and advocate of tariffs. And so he was the tariff man, and fostered the enactment of a big tariff bill, high tariff levels in 1890, when he was chairman of Ways and Means. Didn't turn out too well. It led to an increase in prices across the board in America, and turned out to be quite unpopular. And McKinley actually lost his seat in the Congress as a result of that in 1892. But he promptly announced that he was running for governor, and he was elected twice, two-year terms.
We will certainly have to return to the tariffs. But before, we'll talk more about his presidency too, but I'm curious, how does one become the president or how does one become the nominee of the Republican Party in the late 19th century? What does it mean to be a Republican then? Of course, the sort of anti-slavery aspect of the party in its founding becomes a bit of a moot point after the Civil War and Reconstruction, but maybe not. Maybe that still lingers. But what are the sort of the core commitments of a 19th century Republican, and who is the Republican base or the sort of core constituency that they're appealing to?
Yeah, well, the Republican Party emerged as an anti-slavery party. It came out of the earlier anti-slavery parties that were emerging in America, and coalesced as the Republican Party after the 1856 election. Lincoln, if we study the Lincoln presidency, we can see that he not only freed the slaves and made it impossible forever to have slavery in America with the 13th Amendment, and created equal protection, established and furthered equal protection of the laws with the 14th Amendment. But he fostered policies that were designed to make the Republican Party a very broad-based party that was associated with the explosion of industrial development that was going on in America at the time, the railroads particularly, but a lot of other industrial entrepreneurship. And so the party was the party that of the Homestead Act, the party of land-grant universities, the party of the railroads, pushing the railroads west, further and further west, all the way to the Pacific. And it was the dominant party throughout that entire period. And indeed, it was only Cleveland who could sort of pierce that veil in terms of becoming president. So Cleveland was the only Democratic president between Lincoln and TR, or I should say probably Taft.
And when you think about the sort of the wider political context and like the institutional culture of American politics, could you speak to basically what it took to get elected, so not only what it meant to be a Republican, but how to actually win the presidency at that time? And I think that maybe speaks a little bit to what you were saying about McKinley's demeanor and temperament versus, what we might see today and what's been called a rhetorical presidency, where the president is always out there campaigning for his policy platform every day in front of Americans.
Well, McKinley was an innovator, maybe almost serendipitously, in terms of presidential politics, because this was a time of very high immigration, new waves of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and these people were flocking into the factories to get jobs, and it was they were helping to push American prosperity, and that was McKinley's term, prosperity. That's what I want to generate. That's what I want to create. Um, and but it was increasingly difficult to win elections in the old way. The old way was drumming up support among your base, and for the Republican Party, the base would be the growing, spawning middle class that was moving west and creating towns and churches and communities, mostly along the railroad lines. So you drum up support. So you've heard about the torchlight parades and rallies and those sorts of things. But now it's getting more and more difficult to do that because it was necessary to educate these voters, the new voters, which were part and parcel of the immigration and also the expansion westward and people moving into new communities and new states. And in our electoral system, you had to get those states. So McKinley crafted, and it wasn't necessarily him, but his people, and Mark Hannon particularly, crafted what we might call a more educational model in terms of educating people about what are the issues and how do they affect you. And that meant it was very expensive because it meant buying a lot of newspaper advertising. It meant producing a lot of what we call in the business collateral, that is to say, promotional materials, explaining, not just saying vote for McKinley, but here's why you need to vote for McKinley, and here's what he really stands for. Here's what his opposition stands for, so it wasn't just the torchlight parades, although they didn't go away, obviously, but it was the educational model. And that was new, and it helped usher in McKinley into the presidency.
That's very interesting that he's participating in the education or the sort of civic formation of the people. What were the results of the election? Is this a very close, narrow election like we've seen in the last few years in America, or is this sort of McKinley really ran away with it and had a strong mandate?
It was probably neither of those exactly. I don't recall the numbers, but it was a very solid victory, but not a landslide. Okay. And it was not unusual because the Republican Party, as I say, was the dominant party in America. But just a couple of notes about Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was McKinley's predecessor. And of course, until Trump, he was the only person who had been elected twice in non-consecutive terms. And so Grover Cleveland had a presidency, a term, in the 1880s, and then Benjamin Harrison came in and beat him. And then he had his second term after Benjamin Harrison, and he was not given the nomination afterwards. It went to William Jennings Bryan. So Grover Cleveland was what I call our only two-time one-term president, because he was a one-term president essentially twice. And he presided over a very, very severe recession, probably the greatest economic dislocation of America, other than the Great Depression of the 1930s. So it wasn't unusual or surprising that McKinley would emerge number one as the nominee because he was well positioned, but that he would win because I think it was going to be very difficult for a Democrat to win after that second Cleveland presidency.
That makes sense too. Sort of a referendum on how things were going under the predecessor. And you're talking about the Panic of 1893, right?
I am.
Okay. All right, then let's dive into McKinley's presidency now a little bit, because you sort of mentioned this at the outset. It's a transformational time, and I think we've already gotten a sense of that a little bit. But you have tariffs, the Spanish-American War, which is sort of ushers in the American century, as you pointed out, maybe the advent or maybe the height of American imperialism in some ways, certainly for that time, peak industrialization, or not peak, but sort of peaking industrialization in America as an economic power on the world stage. What are some of the main highlights of McKinley's presidency that kind of make this point that you're making, that he's the one to usher in the American century?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it gives me a lot of fertile ground here. But before I get to that, let me just say one more thing about his election. As a result of the panic of 1893, especially the rural areas, the agricultural areas were just devastated. And that led to a wave of political sentiment that the Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan, exploited brilliantly. He was one of the great orators of our history, and also one of the great populists, and one of the great populist rhetoricians. And so he wanted the free coinage of silver. He wanted a lot of coinage of silver to expand the money supply, because money was tight and these poor farmers were getting squeezed out, and the banks were foreclosing on them, and then the banks were going down. So McKinley entered the campaign thinking that he was going to run, as he always ran, on the tariff issue. But William Jennings Bryan made that impossible. And it took some solid counsel from some of his aides and supporters, who told him, look, Governor, you're going to have to get in this currency question, and the whole question about gold standard, which we believe in as the standard, and the free coinage of silver, which is going to become inflationary. And so he was finally convinced that he was going to have to really establish himself as the gold standard presidential candidate. And by that I don't mean he's the gold standard as the phrase is, but that he supported adherence to gold as the standard of currency for currency stability. And then he had the famous front porch campaign, in which he didn't go out into the country. He let the country come to him. I can't remember, I think 750,000 people did come to Canton. He destroyed his lawn, but he didn't mind. He talked from his porch, and it was all very well organized. And it was a brilliant thing, because people came to him and he didn't have to go chase after the victory, as William Jennings Bryan was doing. He was traveling all over the place. McKinley said, if I try to duplicate him, I'm just going to be duplicating him, and I'm going to go my own route. So that's how he became president. And now your question is, I think, what did he stand for as president? What greeted him in terms of the opportunities and dangers of politics at that time?
Well, he became president, and then what happened?
Well, he became president, and let's just talk about what was happening. First of all, the deep recession was beginning to wane, and the prosperity was returning, and I think that was going to happen even under the Democrats. So that was a very significant benefit. Secondly, he inherited a situation that was fraught with all kinds of political and geopolitical danger, and that was the insurgency against Spanish rule in Cuba. It was a very nasty, brutal period, and it had been a previous insurgency in which many, many people had been killed. The death toll was devastating. And two things were happening as a result of this in America. One was that there was a tremendous amount of humanitarian anger directed at the Spanish for their brutality and attempting to put down the insurrection, and they weren't doing a very good job of it. And the other was that more and more it was becoming clear that this was destabilizing the Caribbean. because there's all kinds of privateers and it just wasn't a good situation for America. It was our backyard, 90 miles from Florida, and it was creating a lot of instability. So there was a lot of agitation in America, and let's get involved in this thing. McKinley was reluctant to just lurch into a war situation. So he entered into very quiet and measured diplomacy with the Queen Regent of Spain. She was running things while her son, who was the next king, was getting to the age where he'd be able to take over. And he essentially said to Spain, look, you got to stop this destabilizing situation in Cuba. And I don't care how you do it. You can win. You can put down the rebellion if you can, or you can negotiate some kind of a settlement. But you got to you got to end this destabilizing situation. And so the Queen Regent, she tried to respond to this, and she actually offered a compromise in which Cuba would still be Spanish, but there would be more autonomy for the Cuban people, for the indigenous people. And she thought that she had essentially addressed his ultimatum, which was a very soft ultimatum, but nevertheless an ultimatum. And when that didn't work, she basically said, well, it's none of your business. And this is Spain's business, and you butt out. Well, we all know that the Maine blew up, but McKinley very audaciously sent the battleship Maine, into Havana Harbor in order to protect Americans who might get caught up in the situation. A lot of Americans, of course, living and working in Cuba. And so he sent the Maine into the harbor, and it blew up. There's no real solid evidence that it was a part of a Spanish insurrection or part of the Spanish government, but nevertheless, it inflamed America to such an extent that it was impossible to outmaneuver that war situation. And by that time, McKinley was very much in favor of strong military response. If you're going to go to war, make sure that you win it, and you win it quickly. And he did. He scribbled on a piece of paper a note that he kept in his pocket throughout the war. And it was not a long war. It only lasted 3 to 4 months. But in that on that piece of paper, he wrote, as long as hostilities continue, we must keep all that we get. As soon as the war is over, we must keep all that we want. And so he was signaling to himself that he was becoming an imperialist, because he's essentially saying that we're going to, and by this time, America had destroyed the Spanish fleet in the Pacific at the Philippines, and we destroyed their Atlantic fleet at Cuba. We essentially took over the island of Cuba. We took, just for good measure, we went over and got Puerto Rico. Then we got Guam and the Philippines. And we had promised when we were agitating about Spain and Cuba that if we got involved, it would not be to our own benefit. We were going to give Cuba its independence if it came to that, which it did. So we didn't take Cuba, although we sort of were kind of a protector of it for a period of time. But we took the rest for different reasons for each that we can go into. But nevertheless, by the time that war was over, Spain was no longer an empire. It was kicked out of the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere, and America was an empire.
I'd be curious if you could speak more to this gold standard versus free silver question and maybe situate it in sort of the larger context of the industrialization and maybe the triumph of American capitalism and economic might that's sort of growing and growing in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, things are getting better economically at a national level, but there's also this sort of this tumult that leaves a lot of frustration. So what was how did he win on the gold standard issue in the election, and then what did that play into in terms of his actual presidency?
Well, it was audacious and bold to embrace the gold standard. It was the policy of the establishment and of the elites. Um, i the one thing you have to have if you want economic growth in any country or polity is liquidity. There has to be liquidity. There has to be readily available money, funds to finance development and investment at the corporate level. And what happened in the panic of 1893 is that liquidity was squeezed, and that happens. That's generally what a recession is. And it dominated politics, as I said before, in that campaign, even though McKinley was reluctant to sort of embrace it as thoroughly as he ended up doing. But McKinley was a kind of a guy who, once he made up his mind, he made up his mind with conviction, and he established one of the first things that he did actually was establish the gold standard as the fundamental American policy designed to maintain currency stability. Now, another thing happened around this time was that there was gold discovered had been gold discovered in 1849 in California. Now there was gold discovered in Alaska. And all that created a greater base for monetary policy and generated liquidity that was desperately needed in a burgeoning, growing America. So it really worked out extremely well for McKinley. He didn't do an awful lot to bring it about, but he didn't get in the way of it either. And he did foster the gold standard concept as America's fundamental monetary policy principle. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and could you maybe, for those who I don't really understand this fully, maybe others in the audience do, but so like when we have a gold standard, I know that the price or the value of the dollar is tied to gold, and so that means that the value of the dollar can't fluctuate very wildly based on it being tied to other things or just tied to nothing. But like when thinking about the politics of this sort of monetary policy, what does that do for the country? Because I guess it sounds to me that if we're tying money to the gold standard, that would constrict liquidity because it restricts the dollar supply in some way. Or maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know.
No, it can do that. Yes, indeed.
So then how at the same time do we have the gold standard and then also have very significant economic growth of this period? And then what would the alternative have been had we moved to the William Jennings Bryan populist free coinage of silver?
Well, the free coinage of silver would have meant that we would have expanded the base upon which our monetary system was based to include silver, a lot of silver, in addition to gold. So that would have increased the liquidity. But the advent of these new gold discoveries made that unnecessary.
Okay. I'm looking at the time and I want to keep us moving because time is limited. The assassination, he's one of the only presidents to ever be assassinated in office. Was there a specific motive for the assassination? Was this an act of political terror? What were the sort of circumstances surrounding that? Because I mean, it's very hard to imagine, especially today, even though there were two assassination attempts on President Trump, that this is really possible. We get the sense, I think, that our president is very safe because of Secret Service and extreme security measures to keep the president safe. But perhaps that was not always the case historically.
Well, McKinley waved aside this security measures, and the Secret Service, his security details were always very, very afraid because he didn't think that anybody could possibly consider the idea of harming him in any way. So in Buffalo, where he was there for essentially the World's Fair, the big exposition, there was a receiving line, and he was really urged to cancel that receiving line, but he didn't. And the assassin, Leon Colesgold, I think it's kind of maybe I'm sort of mispronouncing a little bit, but he was called an anarchist, and it's hard to imagine, but there was a kind of a anti-government, anti-establishment, anti-status quo sentiment that had sort of bubbling up, percolating up within the polity of America. And this guy was one of those people. So he was very vulnerable. And the assassin sort of put his arm in a kind of a sling, and he had a pistol wrapped up in there, and he shot McKinley twice, once in the chest, which didn't go very deeply, would have not hurt him particularly, but the other got into his stomach, and he ended up with sepsis and died 8 days later.
Actually, one thing I'm curious about is why he, in the first term, I don't remember who his vice president was, but for the second term, TR was tapped as the vice president. And you spoke earlier a little bit to the differences in dynamic for, TR was a visionary. He wanted the credit. He wanted the glory. Definitely more in the sort of like maybe modern school of, presidential rhetoric, as opposed to McKinley, who's, he gets his way, but his leadership is stealth and behind the scenes. Why was Teddy Roosevelt picked as the vice president for the second campaign?
Well, it's very interesting. First of all, when McKinley was first elected, his TR's friends urged that he make Teddy Roosevelt the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It was a good job, and it was a job that he could handle. But McKinley was very reluctant because he said to his friends who were Roosevelt friends, your friend Roosevelt, he seems to always end up with agitation and fights, and I'm not sure I want that. He said, no, he'll be fine. So they made him assistant secretary under the Navy secretary who had been the governor of Massachusetts, and he came to appreciate TR, McKinley did, and like him. And he would invite him on these carriage rides that he used to take in the afternoon because he was so animated and clever and yeasty and frothy as a human being. And so he came to kind of like him. Now, there was a lot of interest. Roosevelt was the hero of the day. McKinley was like the great father figure. Roosevelt was the frisky colt who stirred people's imaginations. And he had a huge following. In that following, there was an opening because his vice president had died in office, McKinley's. And so the TR following basically said, that's the job we want. He said he didn't want the job. Then he shows up at the Republican convention wearing his Rough Riders hat. His Rough Riders hat was a symbol of his great popularity, and everyone knew that he would take the job. And Mark Hanna, McKinley's top henchman and his top advisor, basically didn't want to have anything to do with McKinley, didn't want him anywhere near the administration. But McKinley could see that this groundswell of support was a political force that he probably ought not to mess around with. And so he instructed Mark Hanna to back off, and Mark Hanna did. And Roosevelt became the vice president and subsequent, of course, the president.
Right, right. And then, there's the whole Roosevelt's years and all of that, but we don't have time for that. Because I do want to touch on President Trump. There's this business about he wants to rename, I think it's Mount Denali back towards Mount McKinley. And Trump is now talking about, he's a tariff man. Tariff is the most beautiful word in the whole English language. And sort of a recognition that McKinley sort of strove for American greatness, and that this is going to be a big part of the second Trump term. And you wrote about this in The American Conservative, and I'm wondering how you see the parallels and the differences between President McKinley and Donald Trump.
Well, there are two areas in which it's very easy to see why McKinley would beguile Donald Trump once he got to understand who McKinley was and how his administration unfolded. One is tariffs, because McKinley was the great tariff man. And the other is geopolitical foreign policy expansionism, because McKinley presided over the emergence of America as an empire, for good or ill, and it's probably both. So it's easy to see how Trump would get interested in McKinley. And it's also natural, I think, that he would seize on McKinley as a kind of maybe a progenitor of his own thinking. But there are great flaws in that, because 2025 is not 1898. And America of today and the world today is far, far different. For one thing, in those days, there was no income tax. Tariffs were how we got most of our revenue. So it was inevitable that tariffs would be a huge issue whenever it came up, however it came up. And McKinley was the man who always wanted to raise tariff rates if anything seemed to be amiss in the American economy. But the interesting thing about McKinley is that he changed his view. He saw, as he became president and into his presidency, he saw that American productivity was so robust and so explosive in terms of creating products, both agricultural and industrial, that this was going to outstrip the American market. And we were going to have more product than we had markets to absorb those products. And so he crafted this concept of what he called reciprocity, which essentially amounted to bilateral agreements between the United States and other countries, in which he would go to those countries and say, look, I'm a tariff man, and I believe in these tariffs that we have, but I'm going to bring them down if you bring yours down, and we'll have much more of an ongoing, robust trading system, and America will thrive in that environment because we'll have the markets we need for the products we're producing. And he gave a tremendous speech at the exposition in Buffalo the day before he was shot, basically outlining all this because it was his big initiative. The next initiative after this for him was going to be doing something about the trusts, the monopolies in the big industrial areas that were raising havoc in the economy. But the reciprocity concept was number one. And he was cut short, and TR basically went back to the standard Republican view, which was tariffs, and he didn't really pursue the reciprocity concept at all. So and then in terms of foreign policy, well, let me just say this. Consider that the complete total of imports to the United States today is somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 trillion and change, right? And the income that can be taxed is something in the neighborhood of 25 trillion and change. So the base of revenue represented by tariffs is infinitesimal compared to the income tax. And you can't possibly generate enough revenue, even with all the efforts to reduce government that is coming about with this new administration, with tariffs. And Trump doesn't seem to understand that. He may, but he's not talking like he does. So then in terms of foreign policy, yes, he's an expansionist, Trump is. He wants Greenland. But McKinley was what I call a serendipitous imperialist. That is to say, he only put himself in position of acquiring these other colonies or these other entities when the opportunity arose, and he didn't. And almost in every instance, there was a vacuum. These Puerto Rico, Cuba, which we didn't take, as I say, the Philippines particularly, there was a complete vacuum. And if the United States didn't fill it, then Germany was going to fill it, or Japan was going to fill it, or somebody, the Brits were going to fill the vacuum. So that was a little bit different from sort of coming out of the blue and saying we want to take Greenland, or certainly Canada. So it's understandable why he glommed onto McKinley, and he wasn't off base in doing so, but I think he missed a lot of the nuance regarding where we are today compared to then.
Well, then maybe as a closing question, if we were to recognize the contextual, constitutional, institutional differences between McKinley's time and 2025, but also take those principles that McKinley held. And I think it's very interesting to hear you say that, or maybe infer that had McKinley not been assassinated, had we had a few more years of McKinley, how things would have turned out in terms of issues of trade and greater foreign expansion and then the monopolies. But if we were to take the principles that McKinley held and apply them to today in the second Trump administration, what might that look like? Does that question make sense?
I think so. Well, I'm not sure that you can in any direct sense, because the world of the 1890s was a world of Western imperialism, and today is not an era of imperialism. And McKinley was instrumental in bringing forth and crafting a concept of Western dominance that was non-colonial. And the big example of that, and I probably don't have time to get into in any detail, is the policy and having to do with China, the open door policy, which we fashioned. China was being carved up by the industrial powers, and it was just merciless. And we basically said, you got to stop that. Everybody should have equal access to the Chinese market, but we're not going to carve it up anymore. And our trading partners didn't like that very much, but we had the power and the standing geopolitically to make that stick. So I would say that it's hard to make an analogy that way in terms of what it would look like if he pursued McKinley. I think it would look like pretty much what it looks like, which is both understandable and flawed.
Well, fair enough. On that note, I want to thank you, Robert, for joining me and telling us more about what is, I think, definitely after hearing more about him, an underrated president in William McKinley. If people want to follow more of your work, where should they look for that?
Well, I would say that I've written 6 books on American history and foreign policy, and they're all available through Amazon. And so I would urge anybody who's interested in this subject or related subjects. I've got 2 other books on the presidency, a biography of James Polk and a book on the presidency and how it works and how presidents fail and succeed. So I would be delighted to have people checking me out on Amazon or other similar outlets.
Very good. I encourage that as well. Thanks again, Robert.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.